talk. I'm delighted to be presenting Inside the Mind of an Athlete. I hope the sun is shining where you are and that you are safe and well wherever you're tuning in from here today. Just an introduction, my name is Dr. Patricia Jackman. I'm a lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Lincoln. Today, I'm going to talk to you about my passion for sport and exercise psychology, and in particular, I'm going to focus on my main area of research, which Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Lincoln Live talk. I'm delighted to be presenting today Inside the Mind of an Athlete. I hope the sun is shining wherever you are and that you are safe and well wherever you're tuning in from. To give an introduction, my name is Dr. Patricia Jackman. I am a lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Lincoln. Today, I'm going to talk to you about an area that I'm really passionate about, which is sport and exercise psychology. And in particular, I'm going to talk to you about my main area of research, which is all about the science of the mind during optimal human performance in sport and exercise. Essentially, what I'm really interested in is how people feel and think when they're at their best in the sport and exercise domain, and how we can help people to have these experiences more frequently and consistently. By the end of today's session, I hope that I will have increased your knowledge about psychology, that I have raised your awareness about optimal experiences that occur in sport and exercise, and hopefully give you some practical ideas that you could put into practice in your own experiences in sport and exercise. So to give a bit of background about what I'm going to be focusing on, so the topic of psychology is really interested in the science of the mind and behavior. So we're particularly interested in how people think, feel, and behave. And in my case, I'm really interested in that from a sport and exercise perspective. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to have the Olympics this year, which I'm sure we all would have really been looking forward to. But if we imagine any competitive sporting event, people are going to get there on the day of competition. They're going to be well trained physically. They're generally well prepared. Athletes are going to be really skillful, especially at a high performance level. And often what the factor that limits performance is not necessarily that athletes can't perform the skills or that they're not fit enough. Often what can be a challenge for athletes that are often listed in pressure situations. On the other side of things, what we often see is that from a psychological perspective, athletes can often really thrive in pressure situations or in competitive events, and they really excel and reach previously unreached levels of performance. So what I'm really interested in is understanding what is the mindset athletes have when they are at their best. What are the characteristics of their experiences? Now, when we think about excellent performance in sport, I think a really excellent example that we've seen over the last couple of years would have to be Eliud Kipchoge's sub-2-hour marathon last year. So to give a bit of context for those of you who might necessarily know the background to this story, the existing world record in a competitive race for the marathon is 2 hours, 1 minute and 39 seconds. The aim for Eliud Kipchoge was to run this in under 2 hours. So that would require him to take 1 minute and 40 seconds off the time. That equates to going 0.76% faster, which in reality in elite sport is actually a huge level of improvement that was required. Now, the first attempt at this occurred in November 2016, and on the first occasion, Eliud Kipchoge ran really well, delivered an excellent performance, but unfortunately fell a little bit short. On that occasion, it took him 2 hours and 25 seconds. So he was still a little bit short. He needed to find something extra. 3 years later, he returned to attempt the sub-2-hour marathon again, and on this occasion, he was successful. On this occasion, he actually broke it by 20 seconds, finishing in 1 hour 59 and 40 seconds. Now, in the intervening years, there have been a huge amount of financial investment and sports science support that have been put in place to help Eliud Kipchoge achieve this feat. But when you actually look at accounts of what were some of the key factors underlying this improvement in performance, one of the key factors that his manager identified was that there was a huge improvement in confidence in the second effort. On the first occasion in 2016, a challenge for Eliud Kipchoge was that he had to convince his mind that he could do something he had never done before and nobody else had ever done before. After that, he recognized that that gave him some evidence that he could do it. It gave him some belief. And in the week leading up to the event, he spoke about the confidence on the second effort. He really believed that he could go out and run in under 2 hours on this occasion. So I've just spoken to you about Eliud Kipchoge, one of the greatest athletes and one of the greatest achievements of all time from a sporting perspective. And that might create the perception that psychology in sport is reserved for the likes of Eliud Kipchoge's, the Dina Rasher-Smiths of this world, the top 0.1% of athletes. But what I'd like to really get across here today is that psychology in sport and exercise is for everybody. And it's for you just as much as it is for the elite athlete. And what I'd like you to do is to think about a time in sport, perhaps, when you reached a level of performance that maybe you had never achieved before. What was that experience like? Maybe you also had experiences in sport where they were really enjoyable and rewarding, and you came away from it wanting to continue that experience. And for those of you who are involved in exercise, it could be the case that you have really positive, rewarding experiences after bouts of exercise and think that you just want to repeat them again. Because it was experiences like these that really captivated my interest in the area of psychology. And I can guarantee you that they did not happen on the world stage. So in my teenage years, I was involved heavily in sport. And some of these experiences that I started to have during sport were essentially what sparked my curiosity. These experiences occurred on Gaelic Games pitches playing the sport of camogie in rural areas of Ireland, or secondary schools playing basketball. These experiences stood out and they were really different for me. And as I said, they were not on the world stage. So I came off after games and I felt something different had happened. I knew the experience was different and it really stood out as being something unusual. I felt that I had a huge level of confidence and I was almost unstoppable. I felt I could glide, I could move, and unusually for me, I didn't have any negative or critical thoughts. And I played on instinct. I just played almost as though I was on autopilot. But for me, I couldn't put my finger on this. I was starting to come off after games and after having experiences like this, but I didn't know what they were. Nonetheless, I was still really interested in the area of sports science. And this was a progression for me from that was that I really wanted to get into the area of sport and to pursue a degree in this area. So I went on to study a sport-related degree later on. And I suppose in that intervening period, I started to read lots of books, by autobiographies by athletes. I spoke to athletes. I was listening for sound bites on interviews, podcasts, and I was trying to uncover what this experience I was having was through maybe some of the things that they were saying, and I still couldn't put my finger on it. And it wasn't until a lecture in my second year of university where I had that moment where everything made sense. And it was almost like a light bulb went off in that lecture, and all of my experiences that I've been having, they started to make sense, and it was a real almost eureka moment for me. And the topic that we were focused on in that lecture was called flow. Now, flow is a concept that was developed by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, a Hungarian psychologist in the 1970s. His interest actually stemmed from watching artists at work. So he was watching these artists paint for hours and hours on end. And despite the fact that they were getting very little fame and fortune for what they did, it was the thing that gave them such levels of meaning and pleasure, and the most meaning and pleasure that they had in their lives. So he's really interested in what the experience was like. Why do they want to continue to be so absorbed and involved in an activity that gave them little or no extrinsic reward at the end? So he started to study this. He interviewed artists, dancers, surgeons, climbers, and he started to find a pretty similar experience that they described. So when they were really absorbed in what they were doing, they spoke of almost being a sense of the body and mind coming together as one. They were really focused on what they were doing. And also, they had a sense of control over their emotions and over their actions. They also lost concern for the opinions of others. So, those negative thoughts we often have were somewhat disappeared. And also, their perception of time changed. So, whether it slowed down or it sped up. And these experiences were characterized by a huge sense of enjoyment, and they were intrinsically rewarding. So, for these individuals, the act of performing the task was what gave them the rewards. And these tasks tended to occur when they were challenged, but yet they believed they had the skills to achieve them. So, since that lecture, I suppose I've been researching this area now for almost a decade. And whilst my work initially started off in sport performance, as it often does in the case of those who study sport and exercise, it has moved and it's really branched into different areas. So as I've started to focus initially on how could things like flow enhance performance, I've started to wonder, how could it actually impact on people? Might it actually motivate people to want to get more involved? Could it improve their well-being if they're having these experiences more frequently? And what about exercise? What if we could help people to experience flow more often and consistently? Could that actually encourage them to want to stay involved? Could it help us to reduce the amount of people who are physically inactive? Might they want to engage in it because they're finding it so enjoyable? So I suppose as we move on, and I've given you a bit of an intro to this area, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a snapshot as to some of our key research over the last number of years in this area, some of the important points that we've learned. And what I'm hoping is that you'll be able to take away some of these points and put them into practice in your own sport and exercise activities. So this research, it's in collaboration with a number of authors in the UK and in Australia over the last number of years, and a number of published studies that if any of you would like to read more about, please feel free to get in contact with me after today. I'll give my details at the end. So the challenge of researching on flow and optimal experience is that we really need to find people who've had these experiences to learn as much as we can about them. So over the last number of years, we've interviewed athletes and exercisers about who perform at a whole range of different levels and across different activities. And what we wanted to understand was what experiences they were having when they were reaching high levels of performance, and also how these experiences occurred. So really delving into some of the processes that were involved in creating these types of performance experiences. Now, what we found is that irrespective of level, so we've interviewed people who are recreational exercisers right up to world-class athletes, and across a whole range of sports, from your typical team invasion sports right down to more self-paced individual activities. And what we found is that people tend to report similar types of experiences. So one of these experiences is called flow, and as I've just spoken to you about. And I suppose one of the key aspects of our work is that we've started to develop a more refined insight into what flow actually looks like from the perspective of athletes and exercisers. So if we look at athletic contexts, when athletes are in flow, they speak about this experience as being very enjoyable, one in which they're highly, highly motivated. They have a sense of control over what they're doing. They're also very absorbed. So some athletes often speak about almost like being in a bubble. And also it's a state in which they are very confident. In addition, people are very attuned to what they're doing. They're very focused on the task, but it doesn't seem to take the usual amounts of mental effort that it can often take to concentrate. People feel really positive about what they're doing, and also there's no real analytical thought occurring. So often we talk about people who are quite analytical in how they're thinking, they're very much focused on breaking down the skills and so on. But in flow, people don't tend to have those types of thoughts. It's also a state in which people tend to report it being more relaxed, and also it's reported as being an automatic and effortless experience. So there's a lot essentially that culminates in a flow state. Now, what we've started to identify really interestingly over the last couple of years are some of the processes that are involved in these states. So what we tend to find is that flow tends to occur when people might be trying something for the first time, they're experimenting, maybe exploring, or it's a novel situation. And it tends to occur in a 5-stage process. So the first stage is that something good happens. So we refer to this as a positive event. So it could be the case, for example, that a runner in a race makes a good start. The second stage is that we get positive feedback. So we understand that we've made a good start. Okay, that tells us that we're able to maybe sustain the pace so that our body is feeling good. The third stage is that we feel confident. So because of that positive feedback, that starts to build our confidence. And as that happens, we then get to the fourth stage. And that's when we start to challenge ourselves. So as our confidence increases, we start to increase the level of challenge. And the final fifth stage, which is a really new area that's emerging over the last number of years, is the notion of open goals. Now, I will mention my colleague Rebecca Hawkins, who's doing some fantastic work on the area of open goals at the moment at the university. And the idea of open goals is that these goals are purposefully exploratory. They're not specific, they're not measurable, they're not time-based, which is often what we typically think about when it comes to goal setting. These goals tend to be more flexible, open-ended. And this tended to be a key factor that allowed people to get into the flow state. These were often quite spontaneous goals. They weren't preset, they were very much set in the moment. Now, I've spoken about flow, but one of the key findings, I suppose, of our research over the last couple of years is that flow is not necessarily the whole picture when it comes to optimal performance states. So this piece of work that I'm going to talk about for the next couple of minutes is a lot more novel, so it's very much at an early stage of development. But sometimes when people performed at their best, they didn't necessarily have this really blissful flow-like state. They often spoke about a more intense, effortful type of performance experience, where it was almost like they were making it happen. Now, this stage shared some characteristics with flow. It was really enjoyable. After the event in particular, people were more motivated. There was a sense of control. People were absorbed in what they were doing and they felt confident. But what made this distinct was that people were focusing in this state and they had a complete and deliberate focus, so it was more effortful. They had a heightened awareness of the situation. Their effort was really intense. It was a physical effort that they were exerting. They didn't necessarily have negative thoughts, but they could still have quite analytical thoughts. They tended to be a little bit more pumped up, so it was a bit more of a highly aroused state, and yet they were still executing skills at an automatic level. Now, this state we've come to term as a clutch state. So some of you may have heard of clutch performance. And essentially, this experience was considered to be the psychological state that occurred during excellent performance under pressure. Now, as I said, this is still at a very early stage, but one of the key differences we found with this experience is that the types of goals and contexts in which this state occurred were a little bit different. So as I said, this clutch state tended to occur in pressure situations, often when an important outcome was on the line or towards the end of an event, when people were recognizing there was a victory at stake. And the goals people tended to set tended to be specific, measurable, time-based goals, which is very different to flow, which tended to be more open-ended. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the types of goals and the context in which we're in can have a really big impact on our performance experiences. So from that perspective, it's important to recognize that maybe we need to prepare for multiple types of performance states in order to reach high levels of performance. And I suppose from a broader perspective, we need to think about what are the right mix of factors that contribute to these performances. As I finish up, I think one of the great things about this topic that I've talked about and is a key focus of our programs is that it gives a really nice framework to develop your knowledge about psychology. So I've talked about lots of concepts here today: confidence, motivation, arousal, enjoyment. So there are lots of different strands that it gives you an opportunity to delve into more detail with. I hope that today, and as you watch this activity, I hope it's increased your knowledge of psychology, that it's raised your awareness of different types of optimal experiences that we have, and in particular flow and clutch. And also, I hope you have some practical ideas that you can take away today that you might put into practice yourselves. I think there should be a link in the comments to some of this research. So there's an article there which is open access, which means anyone can read it. Led by my colleague, Dr. Christian Swan, who was my former PhD supervisor out in Australia. You can also access more information on this research through my staff profile. If anyone wants to get in touch with me after today, please feel free to email me at pjackman@lincoln.ac.uk. And also feel free to hit me a comment on Twitter as well. So that's @_Trish Jackman. So I think we should have some questions popping up. Okay, so a few questions there. So I'm just going to make my way through them. Ayad, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Hello to you out in the Maldives. It's great to hear that you're tuning in. Hi, Darren. So Darren's question there is how people can gain experience in this area. So I suppose from the perspective of if you're thinking of pursuing a career in sport and exercise psychology, I suppose an important way to go about that is to pursue degrees that are going to allow you to go on to the accreditation routes. But some great ways to do that can be, looking at webinars like this here today, maybe sitting in on some group activities. Is anyone who might be practicing in this area as well? So they might be able to give you some practical insights into the application of this as well. So Thomas George, another good question here. Do you think a certain level of mastery and confidence in a skill, be that in sport, exercise, or physical activity, aids opportunities for an athlete to experience flow or an exerciser? And I think, yeah, it makes sense that having proficiency in a skill is going to help. So if you think about that process that I spoke about, that 5-stage process for flow. So, I mean, if you're more proficient in a skill, arguably you're more likely to have that positive event. That's probably going to give you that feedback and then in turn help you to build that confidence. And if you already have that confidence was at a higher level before the performance, arguably that could be quite helpful actually in helping you to transition into this flow state. So I think it's a really good question. I think as you develop more confidence, okay, it's likely that this is going to help as well. So Sophie Charlton, yeah, I like your question there. What can I do to increase enjoyment of my exercise performance experience? So I'm actually going to draw on some recent work from my colleague Rebecca Hawkins, who I mentioned here. So essentially, one of the key things that Rebecca's work has pointed to is we know in psychology now that the experience you have and the level of pleasure you experience during exercise is actually a key predictor of whether or not you engage in the activity in the future. Actually, how you experience exercise during the activity is a better predictor than how you feel after it. So we really need to focus on helping you and others to enjoy what you're doing. Now, what we've tended to find, and Rebecca's work has started to illustrate, is that the types of goals people set actually elicit different levels of pleasure and enjoyment. So what we found that depending on physical activity levels, this can also have an impact. So people who didn't tend to be quite as active, so maybe they were only beginner exercise or they hadn't exercised for a while, these individuals tended to find that setting those open-ended goals that I spoke about, such as see how well I can do or just see how far I can walk today, those goals tended to elicit more pleasure for those individuals, whereas the SMART goals didn't. Okay, so there was a significant difference there. So the open goals elicited more pleasure for those who weren't routinely as involved in exercise than those who pursued the SMART goals, the specific, measurable, time-based goals. But what we found is that the reverse was the case for those who were more experienced exercisers. So those who are more experienced tend to enjoy and find goals that were specific and measurable more enjoyable and more pleasant than goals that were more open-ended. So I suppose the key message I would try to get across is to be aware of different types of goals. Consider what stage you're at in terms of your exercise. If you're generally quite involved in exercise, think about maybe those more specific, measurable goals. But likewise, if you're starting out, you could think about more of the open-ended goal. Just see how far you can walk on a day or see how far you can walk over the course of a week. The nice thing about that type of goal is that it's less pressurized. It doesn't induce as much stress for the participants we found in other research. So from that perspective, it's just to consider alternative approaches and to really enjoy what you're doing. Find something that works for you, because if you enjoy what you do, you're more likely to want to do that again. So thank you, Sophie. That was a great question. Just see if there are any other questions here that I may have missed. So there's a question here. George, you've asked, can anyone get into flow or is only particular people? What we tend to find is that this isn't necessarily an experience that's limited to certain people. And that what I suppose we're really trying to share and what I'm really passionate about is that experiences like this can be for everyone. But a key factor that we need to, I suppose, learn about over the next few years is how we can help people to have these experiences more frequently and consistently, and crucially, share that with everyone so that we have an impact. And I think that's one of the key areas that we're going to be focusing on in our work here at the university over the next number of years and through our teaching as well, and helping people to have an impact. But going back to your question, I think it's certainly not an experience from my research anyway that is limited to particular people, and it is something that we can all experience at different times. So thank you for some of the comments there. I can see there are some positive feedback, which is great to see. I'm going to start to wrap it up as we get to the end of the activity here today. Just before I finish up, I want to just remind you, same time, same place for the next talk in the Lincoln Live series, which I know are going to be running for another couple of months. And next week's talk is going to be entitled, Do Followers Make a Leader? And that's going to be delivered by Dr. Craig Marsh. So I really want to thank everyone for tuning in today. I hope you found it beneficial, that you've enjoyed it. And I hope you go out there and have some really enjoyable sport and exercise experiences over the next while as well.